Generally, I think that I'm pretty sympathetic with Robert Barron as a Catholic apologist, but he posted a clip from an interview he did with Tucker Carlson, where he talks about the origin of all these sex abuse scandals that have rocked the Catholic clergy for the last 5, 6 decades. And he attributes it largely as a catalyst to the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And I thought that was an extraordinarily brazen and utterly erroneous claim to make. So I want to play the clip. I'm going to probably pause the clip at various points to offer my own interpolations and critical responses, and then offer some concluding thoughts at the other end.
Think that the sex abuse was a result of Vatican II?
Not Vatican II per se. I would say more the result of the sexual revolution and of a loosening of moral strictures. There was, I sense this even as a young man, there was a sense of, we've repressed stuff too long and we really need to be more expressive. And there's too much of this obsession with, sexual sin.
Hey, I want to just note right here how crazy this is, what Barron is saying here. So he's saying that the sexual revolution taught us to be more expressive. Well, that's true. Fair enough. And as a result, like adults began to have sex outside of marriage with greater regularity and without the same social stigma that they did before. But to think that this openness to expression is going to naturally lead to child sexual abuse and grooming, that's insane. You're only going to be led to abusing children and to grooming children and other vulnerable populations if there's something seriously disordered in you. It's not simply a matter of a new level of expressiveness that just sweeps everybody up.
And so, and then the whole culture was, going through a sexual revolution and, stop repressing and, be yourself and express what you're feeling. And I think a lot of priests, frankly, got caught up in that cultural movement.
This is infuriating to me. How Barron is reframing this is to say, well, now keep in mind who he's talking about here are priests who are sexual groomers raping children. And he says they just got caught up in a new wave of sexual expression. To describe them as getting caught up describes them as passive, describes them as being corrupted, disordered, misled by a wider cultural shift, which is a grossly affrontive way of reframing their own moral culpability in their own actions of sexually grooming and abusing vulnerable populations by describing them as simply having been swept up in a broader cultural shift.
And because we can measure it, the clergy sex abuse spiked by the 70s into the very early 80s, and then it began going down. And then,
so he says, "Oh, you can measure it," and by the early 1970s, it was beginning to spike. That's false. It's utterly false that you can measure it. And the reason why you can't measure it is because you don't have reliable statistics going back from the 1950s earlier as to the occurrence of child sexual abuse in the church. And you know why you didn't have that? Largely because of social stigmas that kept people quiet when they talked about these things. Now, here's the irony is the sexual revolution of the 1960s created a new openness about talking about sexuality, which put a new spotlight on the abuse that was occurring in the Catholic Church. So, if anything, I would argue that Barron has it exactly backwards. It's not that the sexual revolution led to a new openness to abusing children. Is that the sexual revolution led to a new awareness that allowed people to talk about the abuse that was ongoing for God knows how long within the church?
and after 2002, when the church put in all kinds of important restrictions, the so-called Dallas Accords being first among them, it's fallen off the table. The statistics have gone completely down. So we can measure a spiking of it right at the height of the sexual revolution. I think that's responsible for a lot of it.
Okay. So That's the clip. Let's now say a few more words by way of debrief. So I take it that Barron is getting some of his data, at least, from what is called colloquially the John Jay Report. It was a 2004 report which was commissioned by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and produced by the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which studied the time period of between 1950 into the early 2000s. And it identified this peak period between 1960 and 1984, which involved about 90% of credible allegations of sexual abuse. A very small number of cases were earlier to that period. And so this is where Barron says, oh, so it's obviously because of the sexual revolution and poor priests just getting swept up in this cultural shift of child sexual exploitation and the grooming of vulnerable populations, I guess. But as I've said, that's, in my view, absurd. The two factors here, first of all, is that there is a lack of solid data earlier in this period in the 1950s, and certainly nothing earlier than that, which wasn't even studied by the John Jay Report. So he has no clue how widespread sexual abuse of vulnerable populations in the Catholic Church was prior to that period because it wasn't being reported. Now, even in this period in the 1950s and 60s, I know myself of people who were sexually abused by Catholic priests in this period. And I know of cases of people being groomed and sexually abused by other adults, including doctors. And what happened at that time was you didn't talk about it. You kept it quiet. It was a social stigma. The child was often tacitly blamed. Well, what did you do? Well, did you misunderstand? There weren't categories to talk about it. You can thank the sexual revolution for introducing. Now, and I'm not, by the way, I'm not giving a general approval here of the sexual revolution, but I would say it wasn't all bad. That it did introduce a new openness to talking about sexuality and thus being able to identify abuse when it occurs. So there's an absence of data before. So Barron is just not in a place. The data is not in a place to support a claim that it spiked in the 1960s and going forward. Nor is he in a place to say that even if it did spike, that it spiked because of the sexual revolution. Now, here's a point to show just how baldly false what he says is. If the sexual revolution led to a spike among Catholic clergy of sexually abusing vulnerable populations, including children, then one would expect that in the general population, there would be evidence for a spike in the sexual abuse, grooming of vulnerable populations, including children, because of the sexual revolution. But I've looked, and I admit I haven't done an extensive study on this, and if people have evidence to the contrary, please let me know. But I haven't seen evidence that the sexual revolution itself contributed to a spike in the sexual grooming of vulnerable populations in the general population. And if it didn't happen there, then the next question would be, well, then why did it happen in the Catholic Church, assuming that what Barron said is true? So even if what Barron said is true, namely that the sexual revolution led to a spike in abuse among Catholic clergy, why among Catholic clergy, but not among the general population? What is it about Catholic clergy that led them to abuse children as a result of as a result of the sexual revolution, but not the general population to have a spike in the sexual abuse of children because of the sexual revolution? That's a problem. So either way, whether his argument works or not, he's it doesn't help him. It doesn't make Catholic clergy look any better either way. Now, here's an analogy for what I think is actually happening here. So let's say you have a large house and there's a basement suite that you don't really do much in the basement. You don't go down there much. But you decide to rent it out to some renters. So you put some renters, they start living in the basement suite, and then they start complaining about rodents. And in your mind, you think, oh, I wasn't seeing rodents in the basement prior to the arrival of the renters. So it must be that the renters themselves are the ones that brought the rodents in. And that's kind of like Barron's thinking. My counter statement here, my counter argument is no, in fact, you weren't going down very often into the basement. So you didn't have reliable evidence of what was happening in the basement. And it was only when renters started living in the basement that they could become aware of the degree to which there were rodents in the basement. That is like the sexual revolution, a new spotlight on sexuality, a new awareness of abuse that began in the 1960s, now put a spotlight on sexual abuse that had been ongoing in the Catholic Church for God knows how long. That is a much more reliable explanation. You don't blame the renters for what was going on because you think they only became aware of the problem when the renters arrived. It doesn't mean they caused the problem. That is the fundamental error in Barron's thinking here. And of course, what this does in essence, as I've referred to DARVO before in some of my videos. So DARVO is where an abuser deflects or sorry denies allegations, um, and then attacks the person who's made the allegations, and by doing says you're actually the problem. And what they do then is to reverse the victim and offender. And I've said as well before in videos that there is DARVO as a formal response of an abuser to abuse allegations against them. But there's also a broader sort of DARVO response. It's kind of like gaslighting, where you're trying to turn it around and saying, no, and it wasn't us. In fact, it was some other catalyst. And Barron's response here strikes me as a kind of broad DARVO response. So not literally DARVO, but DARVO-like, where he says, no, it wasn't the priests who were doing or this thing. They got caught up in the sweep of the sexual revolution. And then you saw a spike in the grooming and sexual abuse of vulnerable populations, including children within the church. And it's just so offensive. Now, what is really going on in here? And what I would say what is really going on here is that sexual predators are attracted to particular occupations that give them proximity to vulnerable populations. So for example, medical doctor, like you know about the stories about abuse allegations linked to family doctors. I know an example like that of a family doctor who abused children in his care because it gave them proximity to the children. So why do you become a family doctor? Well, if you have pedophilic tendencies and you have a desire to abuse children, this gives you proximity to the children through the social status that you are given as a medical doctor. You don't question the doctor, and you give the doctor access to your children. So it's not that the being a medical doctor is somehow problematic in and of itself, or that we should censure or stigmatize medical doctors or the medical profession or the profession of the family physician. But we should recognize that that profession is going to attract predators. And it's the same with clergy. The role of clergy gives a social status within the community, the religious community, and access to the vulnerable population, whether it's children or people who need pastoral counseling, something else. And then predators gravitate naturally to those occupations because it gives them access to the vulnerable population that they want to harm. And I would add a caveat as well that predators don't have to be intentional, or groomers don't have to be intentional about thinking this. It's not like they're thinking, my master plan is to become a Catholic clergy and to abuse children. Rather, I would say in most cases, it's probably much more, they're self-deceived, perhaps to some degree, and rationalizing their behaviors as they go, but they naturally gravitate to positions that give them access to children. And so it's not about the sexual revolution. And for Barron to try to pawn this off on the sexual revolution, when I would submit the sexual revolution introduced the conversation that helped us to become aware of abuse. That's the real issue here. I have two friends who are baby boomers and they're in their 60s now, and both of them had, I will say, close encounters with priests who were predatory priests in the 1970s, sexually grooming and abusing children. But there were no categories at that time to discuss what was happening. So what happened, I think, is that the sexual revolution introduced this new awareness of sexuality, which was going to lead eventually to a new awareness of sexual abuse of vulnerable populations, but that was going to lag behind. So they became aware in the 1970s of stuff is just weird, it doesn't make sense. But by the 80s, 90s, 2000s, there was now a new grammar emerging to talk about things that had happened to people. And so now the spotlight was placed back on the 60s and 70s when this emerging awareness began to appear. And that created the perception of a spike. But in fact, the spike, so-called, we can't comment on that because, to go back to my analogy of the basement suite, you weren't going in the basement. And there was no grammar to talk about child sexual abuse or the abuse of vulnerable populations from the 1950s earlier. So the idea of a spike itself, you can't comment on that. And God knows, again, how many people, how many millions of people have been abused by religious clergy, not just Catholic clergy, but by religious clergy and by doctors and by other people who are predators in various positions that give them access to the vulnerable populations they want to victimize. God knows how often that was happening prior to this awareness that only began to emerge in the latter decades of the 20th century. The thing I want to say to conclude is don't downplay the significance of this because that will only harm you and your credibility as a Christian witness. Some years ago, I reviewed Trent Horn's book, Why We Are Catholic, I think was the title. And I'm going back to my notes on my review of that book. Chapter 16, he had a title says, Why We Believe. Oh, yeah, I think that's the title of the book, Why We Believe. Okay, so he had a chapter, Why We Believe in Spite of Scandal. And I want to quote here from a place. He says, according to the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, about 4% of priests who served between 1950 and 2002 have been accused of sexual abuse. And then Trent adds this, note that accusations do not always mean a crime was committed. Okay, um, this really bothered me when I read it for several reasons. First of all, I'm going to agree with what he says that an accusation doesn't mean a crime was committed. However, I would also say this all the evidence supports the fact that child sexual abuse and the abuse of vulnerable populations historically has been severely underreported. Thus, it is much more likely that there are many more that were, in fact, occurred than the 4% that were reported. Second is the vast majority of cases that are reported as allegations are in fact legitimate. I don't have in front of me data for child sexual abuse allegations, but I will say that for adult sexual assault allegations, the FBI statistics are that approximately 93% are legitimate. So if you have a sexual assault allegation, probably by statistics, 93% of them are legitimate. So the vast majority, I think it's fair to say, of child sexual abuse allegations likewise are legitimate. So I think the conclusion of that is that it's not just 4%, but probably much more higher than 4% of priests have sexually abused children. But let's just stay at 4%. 4% represents tens of thousands of priests globally. Would you be happy? I mean, imagine this, like 4% of something, let's say you go out to eat, but 4% of the meals you're going to buy in a restaurant are going to be fatal. They're going to kill you. Would you say, wow, 4%, that's not too bad. I'm going to go out and eat. If 4% of priests are sexually assaulting, raping, abusing children and other vulnerable populations, that's not a good statistic. Trent seemed to think it was a good statistic. It was favorable to the Catholic Church. I think it's devastating. So I think again, the language of diminishment, just like when Barron talks about how they're just kind of swept up in the cultural milieu and they begin to groom children because of the sexual revolution and the new laxity and openness to sexuality. I mean, baloney. but stop diminishing the abusive actions that occur within your community because it only serves to discredit your witness. So, to conclude, I've given an explanation for where I think what actually is happening. And note that I'm not singling out religious clergy. I'm saying that that which happens in religious clergy also happens in other positions like family physician, where you have a position that gives a predator access to the vulnerable population and a role of authority and power over that vulnerable population, which greatly increases their ability to abuse members of that population. Larry Nasser as the team doctor for US gymnastics, another great example, right? Somebody they gravitate, they're a predator, they gravitate toward a position that gives them access to the target population. So we have to recognize this as a general problem and protect our communities, including in religious communities, against predators in those communities. And the way you don't do that is by pawning off the problem and saying it was really a result of the sexual revolution. Because, as I said, if anything, the sexual revolution gave us a grammar to talk about abuse, which helped us put a spotlight on it. And you don't, so to blame the sexual revolution for things that were God knows how long happening within the Roman Catholic Church is to get things exactly backwards.